The sound was not an explosion. It was the sickening, wet snap of a reality being forced to break. The angel realm, usually a sanctuary of eternal, pale light, was now a jagged landscape of fractured dimensions. Goku screamed a sound that tore through his throat, raw and primal as the crimson scales covering his body began to fissure. The Omega Dragon Fist, the strike meant to shatter the heavens, had collided with the absolute, impassable wall of the Grand Priest's single raised finger. The impact didn't just stop Goku, it unmade him. The backlash of the forbidden power, rejected by a mortal shell that had burned too hot for too long, surged backward. The red dragon aura flickered, sputtered, and then violently imploded. Goku fell from the sky, his body a ruin of smoking scales and torn flesh, crashing onto the marble tiles of the timeless void. He tried to rise, his instincts screaming to fight, but his heart, the Saiyan heart that had loved battle more than life, stuttered. One beat, two, and then silence. The Grand Priest looked down, his expression devoid of malice, devoid of pity, just absolute, cold order. A valiant effort, Son Goku, but a dragon cannot soar if its wings are made of borrowed feathers. He extended a hand, and a beam of pure erasure descended. It struck, Goku's ki vanished. The universe felt the absence immediately, a sudden, terrifying coldness where a blazing fire once stood. Son Goku was dead, but deep within the cooling corpse, beneath the crushed ribs and the silent lungs, something else began to thrum. A black organ, grafted into his very soul by Zalama, felt the host die, and it was hungry. The light has faded, but the nightmare is only just beginning. Before the darkness swallows the screen, bind your fate to this timeline, subscribe and ignite the notification bell. Do not look away. History is being rewritten in blood. The silence that followed the collision was heavier than any gravity Vegeta had ever trained under. It was a suffocating, absolute stillness that pressed against the eardrums, demanding submission. High above the shattered floor of the angel realm, the stardust of a broken reality began to settle, revealing the terrible truth of the celestial hierarchy. The Grand Priest stood suspended in the air, his halo glowing with an indifferent, rhythmic pulse. There was no scratch on his azure skin, no tear in his sacred vestments. He had not fought. He had merely corrected an error in the equation of the cosmos. Below him, the residual energy of the Omega Dragon Fist, an attack that had threatened to tear the fabric of Zeno's palace, had dissolved into harmless sparks, scattered like dying embers in a winter wind. And Son Goku was falling. The red dragon god form, that blasphemous union of Saiyan biology and Zalama's primal sorcery, was unraveling. It was a gruesome regression to witness. The crimson scales that had armored his skin didn't just fade. They shattered, peeling away from his flesh with the wet, tearing sound of stripping bark from a living tree. Smoke, thick and smelling of ozone and cooked iron, poured from his pores. He hit the ground not as a god, but as a broken mortal, the impact lacking any grace. He bounced once, a rag doll of meat and broken bone, before skidding to a halt at the feet of the lesser angels who had survived his initial onslaught. He tried to push himself up. It was the instinct that had defined his entire existence: stand up. But his arms were trembling jelly, the muscles torn from the bone by the recoil of his own power. The red pupils that had held the vertical slit of the dragon widened, dilating in panic as his vision blurred. He coughed, and the pristine marble beneath him was splattered with a dark, boiling fluid that was no longer quite blood. Ambition. The Grand Priest said softly, descending slowly, his feet never touching the grime of the battlefield. His voice was not loud, yet it resonated in every corner of the dimension. It is the gift of mortals and their curse. You sought to wear the skin of a primordial beast, Son Goku. But you failed to understand that power without divine authority is merely self-destruction. Goku gasped, his chest heaving as his lungs struggled to find air in the thinning atmosphere. He looked up, one eye swollen shut, the other fixing on the small, childlike figure of the priest. There was no anger in Goku's heart anymore. The rage of the dragon had burned itself out, leaving only a cold, hollow cavity. He felt heavy. He felt the crushing weight of his own mortality pressing down on him, a mountain he finally could not lift. Goku rasped, the word turning into a wheeze. I just wanted to break the limit. Limits exist for a reason, the Grand Priest replied, raising his hand. The gesture was casual, almost gentle. They separate existence from entropy. You have crossed the line, and now you must be erased. Not out of malice, but for the sake of balance. A single sphere of white energy, no larger than a marble, formed at the tip of the Grand Priest's index finger. It did not crackle or roar. It hummed with the terrifying frequency of absolute erasure. Goku watched the light. He thought of Chi-Chi, of Gohan, of the promise he made to Vegeta. But those thoughts were distant now, fading like dreams upon waking. The pain in his body began to numb, replaced by a creeping coldness that started in his toes and raced toward his heart. The forbidden dragon bloodline had demanded a price he could no longer pay. His ki, usually a roaring ocean, was now a dried-up creek bed. The priest flicked his finger. The beam pierced Goku's chest. There was no explosion, just a soft thud, like a heavy book closing in a quiet room. The remaining red aura flickered once a desperate dying candle in a hurricane and then vanished. Goku's head fell back against the stone. His eyes, once full of the innocent joy of battle, glazed over, reflecting the infinite white void above. The chest rose one last time, a shuddering breath that rattled in his throat and then settled. The heartbeat stopped. The silence returned, but this time it was permanent. The greatest warrior of Universe 7, the man who had challenged gods and befriended kings, was dead. His body lay twisted and smoking, a ruined monument to a failed revolution. The angels watched, their faces impassive masks of divine law. They felt no sorrow. To them, a star burning out was simply the natural order of things. The Grand Priest lowered his hand, turning his back on the corpse. It is done. Clean this mess. But he took only one step before the air behind him grew cold. Not the cold of space, but the freezing burn of a deep, ancient ocean. A vibration started in the floor, a low, discordant hum that didn't come from the environment, but from inside the carcass on the floor. Death is usually a departure. The soul, untethered from the biological machine, drifts into the other world, seeking judgment or paradise. But for the vessel known as Son Goku, the door to the afterlife did not open, it was bolted shut from the inside. Deep within the ruined chest cavity, buried beneath the cauterized flesh where the Grand Priest's beam had struck, something stirred. It was not an organ of flesh and blood. It was a dense, pulsating singularity, the dark dragon heart. Zalama had not given Goku a mere power boost. He had implanted a parasite, a failsafe designed to activate only when the host's will was extinguished. While the surface of Goku's body grew cold, the core began to heat up with a feverish, unnatural intensity. The heart did not beat. It spasmed. It thumped against the ribs with a wet, heavy rhythm, like a hammer wrapped in wet leather. Thump, pause. Thump, the sound was audible now. The lesser angels, who had moved forward to collect the body, froze. They exchanged glances, their serene expressions cracking with confusion. The Grand Priest stopped mid-step, his head tilting slightly to the side. His omniscient eyes narrowed. He could see the flow of time and energy, but looking at Goku's corpse now was like staring into a black hole. Information went in, but nothing came out. Strange, the priest whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The soul is gone. And yet, on the floor, the body began to convulse. It wasn't the twitching of dying nerves, it was a violent reconstruction. The spine arched upward with a sickening crack, snapping back into alignment. The skin, scorched and gray, began to darken further. It didn't burn, it necroticized. The remaining red scales that clung to his arms didn't fall off, they were absorbed, sucked back into the dermis, as if the body was eating itself to survive. A shadow began to leak from Goku's mouth. It spilled over his lips like thick, black ink, pooling around his head and defying gravity to crawl up his cheeks. It filled the hollows of his eyes, drowning the glazed-over white in absolute darkness. Inside the mindscape, where Goku's consciousness should have been, there was no Goku. There was only the hunger, the primal instinct of the dragon god Zalama, stripped of wisdom and restraint. It was a consciousness made of pure survival, a biological imperative to consume, to evolve, to dominate. The Red Dragon had been a partnership, this was a takeover. The muscles on the corpse swelled, tearing the remains of the orange ghee. The flesh turned a deep, obsidian black, a color so profound it seemed to absorb the ambient light of the angel realm. Veins bulged, glowing with a faint, purple bioluminescence, pumping a mixture of corrupted ki and dragon blood through the revived system. Thump thump. The sound echoed like war drums now. The floor beneath the body cracked, spiderweb fractures spreading outward. The atmosphere grew heavy, the divine pressure of the angel realm being pushed back by a suffocating, dense miasma. It smelled of old blood and ozone, of ancient caves and things that slithered in the dark before stars were born. Destroy it, the Grand Priest ordered, his voice suddenly sharp, abandoning his usual calm. Now, 3 angels, the nearest to the body, raised their staffs. They didn't hesitate. 3 beams of pure, white erasure energy fired simultaneously, converging on the twitching black form. The energy struck the body and vanished. It wasn't deflected, it wasn't absorbed, it was simply eaten. The black skin seemed to open its pores and drink the light. The energy that could wipe out galaxies was swallowed whole by the anomaly. Slowly, terrifyingly, the thing on the floor began to stand. It didn't rise like a martial artist, fluid and balanced. It rose like a puppet being jerked by invisible strings, limbs snapping into place, neck craning at an unnatural angle. The spine straightened with a sound like a tree trunk snapping in a storm. The entity stood tall, dwarfing the angels around it. It was Goku, but stripped of all humanity. His hair, usually a defiance of gravity, now hung heavy and wet, pitch black and trailing down his back like a mane of shadows. His chest heaved, not with breath, but with the venting of excess heat. And then the eyes opened. There were no pupils. There were no irises. There was only a blank, glowing purple void. No intelligence, no mercy, no recognition, only a bottomless pit of hunger. A low growl started in its throat, a sound that vibrated the very air molecules, causing the halos of the surrounding angels to flicker. It wasn't a word, it was a frequency, the sound of a predator waking up in a nursery. The atmosphere in the angel realm shifted instantly from a battlefield to a tomb. The golden, ambient light that permeated this dimension, a light that had shone since the dawn of the multiverse, seemed to recoil from the figure standing in the crater. Shadows didn't just cast off the entity, they clung to it, swirling like oil in water, creating a silhouette of absolute negation against the pristine white background. The entity that was once Son Goku took a step forward. The sound was wet, like a boot stepping into fresh mud. The lesser angels, usually the picture of stoic grace, instinctively floated backward. They were beings of instinct as much as power, and their instincts were screaming a single, terrifying word: predator. Identify. One of the guardian angels commanded, his voice wavering slightly. He leveled his staff, the gem at its tip glowing with the authority of the Grand Priest. "You are in violation of divine law. Cease your bud." The creature didn't let him finish. It didn't use instant transmission. It didn't use a burst of speed. It simply warped. One moment, it was 10 meters away. The next, it was occupying the space directly in front of the angel. The angel gasped, staring into the purple void where eyes should have been. There was no recognition in that face, no martial artist analyzing a technique. The entity tilted its head, a twitchy avian movement, and then opened its jaw. It didn't punch. It didn't fire a blast. It bit. The entity's jaws clamped onto the angel's shoulder. The sound of divine armor woven from the hardest materials in creation, shattering like glass, echoed through the void. The angel screamed, a sound that angels were never meant to make, as the entity tore backward. It didn't just rip flesh. It tore the key out of the victim. A stream of blue-white light rushed from the wound into the creature's mouth. The angel fell, pale and shriveled, his halo flickering out like a broken bulb. "Abomination," the Grand Priest murmured. For the first time in eons, his hands were not clasped behind his back. They were raised, fingers tensed. He could see the energy signature of the beast. It wasn't just consuming ki. It was consuming existence. It was an anti-Genesis engine. Every second it stood there, it was erasing the reality around it to fuel its own impossible resurrection. "Do not engage in melee." The priest's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "It feeds on contact. Use long-range erasure. Wipe it from the canvas." The remaining angels, shaken by the brutality they had just witnessed, flew high into the air. They formed a circle, a halo of judgment above the black monster. 50 staffs pointed down, 50 spheres of destruction gathered. The air hummed with the collective power of the angelic host, enough energy to vaporize a supercluster of galaxies. Fire. The sky turned white. A pillar of destruction descended, a hammer of God slamming into the anvil of the void. The impact shook the foundations of Xenos' palace miles away. The light was blinding, a purification so absolute that nothing should have survived. But as the light faded, a low, grinding laughter emerged from the smoke. The entity was still standing. The attack hadn't vaporized it. It had only made it stronger. The pitch-black skin was now pulsing with a rhythmic, purple glow, the veins beneath the surface swollen with the stolen energy. The dark dragon heart was metabolizing the erasure energy, converting the order of the angels into the chaos of the dragon. The creature looked up. Its mouth widened into a grin that stretched too far, tearing the skin at the corners of its lips. A roar erupted from its throat, not a scream of rage, but a shockwave of pure malice. The sound shattered the remaining marble tiles for miles. The sheer pressure of the roar blew the lower angels out of the sky, scattering them like leaves in a hurricane. This was no longer a fight. It was a harvest. The Grand Priest narrowed his eyes, analyzing the data. It adapts to energy based on divine law. It inverts the properties of creation. He realized, with a chill, that he could not simply blast it away. To fight this monster with standard divinity was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. "Back!" The Grand Priest ordered, floating higher, creating distance. "Do not feed it." The entity, sensing the retreat, crouched low, its spine spiked with jagged protrusions of black bone. It was preparing to hunt. But before it could leap, a new tier in the dimension opened above. A purple, jagged energy signature, crude, violent, and arrogant, spilled into the realm. "Step aside, you feathered cowards," a voice boomed, dripping with unearned confidence. "If the angels are too fragile to take out the trash, then a god of destruction will do it." Cidra, the destroyer of Universe 9, descended from the rift, his energy flaring in a chaotic storm. He had been watching from the margins, waiting for a chance to curry favor with the Grand Priest, to prove that he was not the weakest of the destroyers. He landed heavily between the priest and the monster, his hands glowing with the purple light of Hakai. The entity stopped its advance. It turned its void gaze toward the new arrival. It tilted its head again. It smelled a new flavor. Cidra landed with a flourish, the marble cracking under his boots, not from weight, but from the sheer density of his ego. He stood with his chest puffed out, his green skin gleaming with sweat and anticipation, the purple aura of destruction swirling around him like a royal cloak. He glanced back at the Grand Priest, a smirk playing on his lips, hoping for a nod of approval. He received only a cold, unblinking stare. "You are out of your depth, destroyer," the Grand Priest warned, his voice devoid of its usual polite cadence. "Leave this place, now. With all due respect, Grand Minister." Cidra scoffed, turning back to face the blackened, twitching creature. "You angels are too delicate. You treat erasure like a scalpel. Sometimes you need a hammer." He flexed his hands, the Hakai energy condensing into jagged, unstable orbs. "And I am the hammer." He looked at the entity. "So, this is the mighty Son Goku, the mortal who dared to touch the forbidden realm." Cidra chuckled, a wet, rasping sound. "Look at you, a charred husk, a failed experiment. You reek of desperation." The creature did not respond. It stood perfectly still, its arms hanging long and loose, knuckles grazing the floor. The purple void in its eye sockets was fixed on the pulsating energy in Cidra's hands. The dark dragon heart thumped a slow, heavy beat that seemed to sync with the throbbing of Cidra's own pulse. Thump. "Nothing to say," Cidra mocked. "Good. Die silently." He thrust his hands forward. "Hakai!" The energy of destruction, the power to unmake matter and soul, erupted from his palms. It was a torrent of purple light, screaming as it tore through the air. It was a sloppy attack, lacking the precision of Beerus or the elegance of Whis, but it was raw and heavy. It slammed into the creature's chest with the force of a collapsing star. Smoke billowed. The ground cratered. Cidra threw his head back and laughed. "See? Dust. Nothing but dust. The problem is solved. I have." The smoke cleared. Cidra's laughter died in his throat. The creature was still there. It hadn't moved. It hadn't dodged. The Hakai energy was currently swirling on its chest, a vortex of purple destruction that should have erased it instantly. But instead of disintegrating, the black skin was rippling. The chest of the beast opened like a secondary mouth, a vertical slit in the torso that exposed the pulsating black core beneath. The Hakai energy was sucked into the slit. Slurp. The sound was obscene. The creature absorbed the destruction energy, and the black veins on its body flared bright violet. The energy of a god of destruction, designed to erase, had just been used as a battery. Cidra stumbled back, his eyes widening in genuine terror. "Impossible. That is Hakai. It cannot be stopped. It cannot be." The creature moved. It wasn't a warp this time. It was a dash, a feral, four-legged sprint that closed the distance in a heartbeat. It moved like a wolf, low to the ground, trailing shadows. Cidra didn't even have time to raise a shield. The beast leaped, its hand, now tipped with claws made of solidified darkness, clamped around Cidra's throat. The momentum carried them both into the air. Cidra gagged, clawing uselessly at the arm that held him. He tried to summon his ki, to blast the creature off, but he found he couldn't. The moment the claws touched his skin, his energy flow reversed. It wasn't flowing out to strike, it was flowing in to be consumed. They crashed into a floating pillar, shattering the stone. The creature pinned Cidra against the debris, lifting the destroyer off his feet. Cidra kicked and thrashed, his face turning a dark shade of teal as the oxygen was cut off. "Let Go. Cidra wheezed, his eyes bulging. I am a god. The creature brought its face close to Cidra's. The purple void stared into the god's fearful eyes. Then, slowly, the creature's mouth opened. A long, black tongue, like a serpent's, tasted the air. God, the creature rasped. It was the first word it had spoken. The voice wasn't Goku's. It sounded like grinding stones, like the tectonic plates of hell, shifting, empty, calorie. The Grand Priest watched from above, his expression finally hardening into something approaching concern. He saw the threads of fate snapping. He saw the balance of the multiverse tilting dangerously. It is learning, the priest whispered. It is categorizing divine energy as food. Cidra screamed as he felt his divinity being ripped away. His aura, his god ki, his life force, it was being siphoned out through the grip on his throat. He withered, his muscles shrinking, his skin losing its luster. The arrogance drained out of him along with his power, leaving only a terrified, dying creature. The moth had flown into the inferno, and now the inferno was eating it alive. The scream of a god of destruction is a sound that reality is not designed to endure. It is not merely a vocalization of pain. It is the frequency of a fundamental universal constant breaking down. As Cidra shrieked, the purple aura that defined his existence was stripped away in jagged, tearing ribbons, sucked voraciously into the black entity's gripping hand. Cidra's body began to atrophy. His once bulky frame collapsed in on itself. His green skin turned gray, then ashen white. His eyes, usually burning with the arrogance of authority, dimmed until they were nothing but hollow, terrified pits. He looked down at the creature, at the face that wore Goku's features like a mask, and saw no malice. He saw only the biological indifference of a shark tearing into a seal. Grand Minister, Cidra gasped, his voice a dry rattle. Help me! The Grand Priest did not move. He hovered in the middle distance, his eyes locking onto the spectacle with cold calculation. To intervene now, to strike the beast while it was feeding, would risk the release of the chaotic energy it was absorbing. An explosion of that magnitude, fueled by the essence of a destroyer and the antimatter of the dragon heart, could crack the foundation of the multiverse itself. The priest made the only choice logic dictated. He watched the sacrifice. The entity tightened its grip. With a wet, crunching sound, the last dregs of Cidra's god ki were extracted. The destroyer of Universe 9 went limp. He was not dead in the mortal sense. He was worse. He was a husk, a hollow shell of skin and bone, void of the divine spark that gave him purpose. The creature dropped him. Cidra's body fell silently, tumbling into the endless white void below, forgotten before he even vanished from sight. The beast stood up. It was changing again. Having consumed a god of destruction, the entity's evolution accelerated. The pitch-black skin began to harden, forming an exoskeleton of armored plates that resembled the chitin of an insect mixed with the scales of a dragon. Spikes erupted from its shoulders and elbows, curving backward like serrated blades. The purple glow in its veins turned a deeper, more violent shade of violet, the color of pure Hakai. It threw its head back and roared. This time, the roar carried the distinct, metallic resonance of destruction. A shockwave of purple light exploded outward, vaporizing the debris of the pillar it had been standing on. The shockwave rolled across the angel realm, forcing even the Grand Priest to raise a barrier. The entity lowered its gaze. The hunger was not satiated, it was emboldened. It looked up at the Grand Priest. The void in its eyes swirled, and for a fleeting second, a pupil formed a vertical, crimson slit. Intelligence was returning, but it was cold, calculating, and utterly alien. More, the creature growled. The voice was clearer now, layered with the echoes of Cidra and Goku. More. Light. The Grand Priest felt a chill that he hadn't experienced since the original sealing of the demon realm eons ago. This was not a rogue Saiyan. This was an invasive species, a contagion, and it had just tasted the blood of the divine hierarchy. "The experiment is concluded," the Grand Priest announced. His voice was no longer soft. It was the voice of the highest authority in the multiverse. The halo behind his head began to spin, expanding into a complex geometric mandala of light. "You have consumed a destroyer. You have desecrated this holy ground. There is no prison for you. There is only the end." The priest raised both hands. The entire dimension began to tremble. Above them, the infinite white sky darkened as millions of stars began to manifest, not stars of fire, but stars of pure, white erasure energy. It was the Grand Priest's ultimate sanction, the heavens fall. The entity did not cringe, it did not cower, it bent its knees, the stone beneath it turning to dust under the pressure. The violet aura around it flared, mixing with the black smoke of the dragon heart, creating a towering column of energy that rivaled the priest's own light. It bared its teeth in a smile that was all hunger. The food was fighting back, and the beast loved a struggle. The stars burned quietly, looking down on the two titans, one of absolute order, one of absolute chaos. The realm held its breath. The silence before the clash was not peace. It was the intake of air before a scream that would wake the Omni King himself.